know that as your waist expands, your brain shrinks.
What?
Yeah, it's related to
Max Lugavere.
He's the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Genius Foods.
A brain food expert.
He's just the best in the world at what he does.
There's a lot of misinformation out there. And so my passion is to know what's true. So when it comes to sugar, your average adult today is consuming 77 grams of added sugar every single day. That's almost 20 teaspoons.
Jesus Christ.
But the issue is we're designed to overconsume those foods. So you're fighting against millions of years of evolution.
How do we solve that?
I haven't gotten asked that anywhere else. And so what they're finding is that you just using a sauna 2 to 3 times a week is associated with a 22% risk reduction for dementia. And using it 4 to 7 times per week is associated with a 65% reduced risk for the development of dementia. So that's like a dose response. The more you use it, the more robust the health effect seems to be. And it's not just for dementia. They've seen a reduced risk for hypertension, which we know is really important. We know that the brain, that blood pressure is really important from the standpoint of brain health. So you want to make sure that your blood pressure is healthy. That hormesis, which is like low doses of, low to moderate doses of a stressor, actually are as opposed to being, rather than being harmful to the body, actually elicit an adaptive response that makes the body come out on the other side stronger and more resilient. And so that is that's essentially the mechanism, the proposed mechanism underlying why it seems that saunas are beneficial to our health, but also exercise, and also cold water immersion, and also intermittent fasting. The more you use it, the more robust the health effect seems to be. And that is, we know that when you use a sauna, it does have a positive impact on your blood pressure. We know that it can reduce inflammation. That's the whole concept underlying hormesis. That hormesis, which is like low doses of, low to moderate doses of a stressor, actually are as opposed to being, rather than being harmful to the body, actually elicit an adaptive response that makes the body come out on the other side stronger and more resilient. And so that is that's essentially the mechanism, the proposed mechanism underlying why it seems that saunas are beneficial to our health, but also exercise, and also cold water immersion, and also intermittent fasting, and also even some of these like plant compounds. Like we consume myriad compounds in plants that if we were to consume big doses might actually have a toxic effect. I can define that if you want, because it's a term that I feel like I use a lot these days. And, ultra processed foods are foods that you couldn't possibly make in your own kitchen. They tend to be shelf stable. They tend to, so you tend to find them in the aisles of our supermarkets. They have long shelf lives. They come in packages. They tend to have long ingredients lists, oftentimes with ingredients that you don't recognize. So that right there is a key. Some people listening to this might say, oh, well, that's a naturalistic fallacy. Not everything that we can pronounce is good for us, and not everything that we can't pronounce is bad for us, right? I think that's a pretty poor argument. Yeah, it's good for weight loss to prioritize protein and fiber, dietary fiber. And then water. So water is the #1 enemy of shelf stability. And so ultra-processed foods, they want long shelf lives. It can be shipped overseas. It can stay for months on the shelf. Very little waste. And so products like Pringles, devoid of water, they're completely dehydrated, right? And water, sometimes when we're hungry, we're actually thirsty. It's just that those wires are getting sort of crossed and miscommunicated. But your average hunter-gatherer didn't have access to, running water. They couldn't just pop into their local gas station and buy bottled water. I can define that if you want, because it's a term that I feel like I use a lot these days. And ultra processed foods are foods that you couldn't possibly make in your own kitchen. They tend to be shelf stable. They tend to, so you tend to find them in the aisles of our supermarkets. They have long shelf lives. They come in packages. They tend to have long ingredients lists, oftentimes with ingredients that you don't recognize. So that right there is a key. Some people listening to this might say, oh, well, that's a naturalistic fallacy. Not everything that we can pronounce is good for us, and not everything that we can't pronounce is bad for us, right? I think that's a pretty poor argument. They would get it from food. They would get it from fruits and vegetables, and even animal products are a good source of hydration. So oftentimes when we think that we're hungry, we just need a little bit of hydration. So all those three factors, the protein, the fiber, and the hydration, are all severely lacking in Pringles and other ultra-processed foods. So our lifespans are expanding, but we're actually spending more of our life, especially particularly in our latter years, sick, burdened with chronic disease and disability. And I think that's just crucially important. So what that implies is, as we age, that we continue to be mobile and to move about the world and to be free of depression, and we stay connected in our communities. And I think, eating a healthy diet, exercising, staying socially connected. I mean, averting loneliness. These are all crucially important. And
It seems like this kind of miracle drug, because everybody can point to the upsides of having coffee in the morning, whatever, and nobody seems to be able to tell me what the cost of that is.
so, people metabolize. So for people who are chronically stressed, adding coffee to the mix is probably, just adding fuel to that fire. But it can stimulate cortisol release, and it is a powerful stimulant. It can also negatively impact sleep. So that's why, for many reasons, you want to make sure that you are consuming it, far away from bedtime. But it honestly is hard to find a downside to coffee. I mean, there really is good, but it's always important to caveat these findings with the fact that these are averages. So on average, coffee seems protective, but certainly within those cohorts that are being studied, some people are doing really poorly with coffee as well. So you just, it's something that you really have to regularly take inventory and ask yourself, is this working, for me? I think one of the healthier ways to ingest coffee is to not consume it immediately after waking up, which, I'm guilty of doing many days, but it's generally something that's you're better off consuming an hour or two after you wake up. And again, not too late into the afternoon either. But they probably are getting grumpy because their lives lack the joy and excitement that they once felt, right? Time is just accelerating, that moving walkway that we are all on towards the inevitable decrepitude of old age, right? It seems to go faster and faster and faster the older we get. But it's not because time actually is moving any faster. It's because we get so stuck in our ways. Our routines become so cemented. And what we fail to realize, and hopefully this, me saying this shakes people out of their comfort zones, and inspires people to shake things up a little bit. This Groundhog Day syndrome, it causes our brains to just shear away for the sake of efficiency. I mean, it's got good intentions, right? But it shears away all the joy. So you just become this rote automaton. So when you do the same things every single day, what does your brain do? It prunes away excitement, joy, happiness. The dopamine response is just completely blunted. And that's why, as you get older, people universally, right? It's a human universal. People report that time just accelerates, right? Where did the last decade of my life go? It's not that time accelerated, right? It's just that your life has become so routine. So anything that the brain can do to make its functioning more efficient, it'll do. So when you do the same things every single day, what does your brain do? It prunes away excitement, joy, happiness. It's just that your life has become so routine. But they probably are getting grumpy because their lives lack the joy and excitement that they once felt, right? Our routines become so cemented. This Groundhog Day syndrome, it causes our brains to just shear away for the sake of efficiency, but it shears away all the joy. So you just become this rote automaton, and the joy, the excitement, it's just, it's something that you cease to experience. Whereas when you look back at your youth, for example, it's not that time actually moved slower. It's that every day was different.
And our lives become autopilot. Why does living a life on autopilot have an impact on my happiness? And I'm still yet to hear a compelling argument against having coffee in and amongst your diet, as you say, a few hours after you wake up. So one of the things that really did catch me off guard was it was in your book, The Genius Life, where you talk about this study with the mice, and you make the case that travel has positive relationships with health. Like it has health benefits. Not something I've ever heard anybody say before, that travel is good for our health.
Yeah. Wow. I'm glad you brought that up. Because that also kind of parlays into another concept that I've been lately thinking about a lot for the first time. Well, first of all, so the study that I talk about in the second book, The Genius Life, is the fact that they, just how important novel experiences are for the brain. It's about living more fully. It's like breaking the routine and like getting back some of that joy and excitement that we have about life, or maybe signing up for a new gym membership and sustaining that because of what you now know it does for mental health, exercise. So
it's a balancing act, as you kind of alluded to earlier on, between familiarity, community, comforts, and those kinds of things, but keeping your foot one step outside of your zone of comfort. So you have the like stimulation and the joy and the spontaneity of life at the same time. So I can get a little bit too comfort, and that will have adverse effects on a lot of things.
And but I also, I love travel, but whenever I get like pushed to do those kinds of things, like to travel, I never regret it. We tend to overconsume it, not just being overweight, but like obese, 1 and 2. So for that person, sugar really is something, added sugar in particular, is something that really ought to be minimized, if not altogether avoided. Our average adult today is consuming something like 77 grams of added sugar every single day. Manufacturers will use a compound called maltodextrin, which is essentially sugar. There are sugar alcohols, which sugar. So you just really want to be careful with the non-caloric sweeteners that you're ingesting, making sure ultimately that you're not ingesting too much, particularly of like these fake fibers and some of the artificial, or some of the the sugar alcohols, because they can really wreck your gut.
What's your personal sort of diet regime as it relates to sugar? Do you have sugar in your diet?
The biggest problem I think today with regard to sugar is added sugar. So it's not sugar that's naturally found in food. All plant foods have some quantity of sugar. Even kale has a tiny amount of sugar. Mostly you'll find it most concentrated in fruit, obviously, which is like the primary source of naturally occurring sugar in the produce section of the supermarket in whole fruit. But the most pernicious source of sugar today is the added sugar. The sugar that is added by food manufacturers to ultra processed foods, usually with the intent of making those foods hyper palatable. But it's just a very fascinating thing, because we tend to think about like childhood trauma as being like big T trauma, like I was sexually abused or something like that, which, I had a wonderful childhood. I never would have used the T word to describe anything that happened to me in my childhood. But then there's like, nobody escapes childhood social injury free. We all have trauma, whether it's like we're not picked up at the right time, or we're, ignored at the wrong time, or what have you. And so nobody escapes childhood trauma free, is what I've learned. And so those traumas, it's like a butterfly effect. They have a way of creeping out, in ways that are not often obvious when we're adults, and they affect our relationships in sometimes profound ways. Well, I do what I do because the most important person in my life, my mother, was very ill from a very young age. But ultimately, my mission in life, I think my purpose in life, is to help people feel better, live longer, live healthier, and to avert ultimately the kinds of conditions that my mom struggled with for so many years. It was around the year 2011. She was 58 roughly at the time.
Max, why do you do what you do, and what do you do?
Oh man, what a place to start. I do what I do because the most important person in my life, my mother, was very ill from a very young age. And that was the most traumatic, seeing her go through what she went through was the most traumatic thing I've ever had to endure in my life. And ultimately, it led to me losing her.